It was born from a failure. An aircraft so troubled that its tail sometimes tore off in flight, an engine that quit without warning, a cockpit that quietly filled with poison. By every reasonable measure, the program should have been canceled. Instead, engineers took that flawed machine, gave it a new wing and a longer nose, and produced what many pilots would call the finest fighter Britain ever flew with a propeller. It became the fastest thing the Royal Air Force could put low over the English Channel, the deadliest hunter of Hitler's flying bombs, and one of the few Piston fighters that could chase down a jet. And yet today, almost nobody outside the world of historians can even name it. This is the story of the Hawker Tempest, and why the most capable British fighter of the war is also its most forgotten. To understand the Tempest, you first have to understand the disaster it grew out of. In the late 1930s, the Hawker Company set out to build a successor to its famous Hurricane. The Hurricane and the Spitfire had carried Britain through the Battle of Britain, but designers knew the next generation of German fighters would be faster and climb higher. They wanted a Brute, an aircraft built around an enormous new engine that promised far more power than anything before it. That aircraft became the Hawker Typhoon, and almost everything about its early life went wrong. The new engine was a monster of complexity, and in its first years it was desperately unreliable. Engines failed on takeoff and quit over the sea. Worse, the Typhoon had a deadly structural flaw. The rear of the fuselage could fail under stress, and pilots died when their tails simply broke away in a dive. Then came reports that exhaust gases were leaking into the cockpit, slowly poisoning the men flying the machine. And after all of that, the Typhoon turned out to be a poor performer at high altitude, exactly the job it had been designed for. Its wing was too thick, and as it climbed, the speed bled away. On paper, the project was a catastrophe. But the Typhoon had one redeeming quality that would change its fate, and eventually give birth to something far greater. Down low near the ground, it was astonishingly fast and astonishingly strong, so the Royal Air Force stopped asking it to be a high-altitude interceptor and turned it into a low-level weapon instead. Typhoons hunted German fighters that came skimming across the Channel to bomb coastal towns, machines that no other British fighter could reliably catch at wave-top height. And carrying bombs and rockets, the Typhoon became one of the most feared ground attack aircraft in Europe. Out of a failed interceptor, the British had stumbled into a superb low-level brawler. But the men at Hawker knew they could do better. The thick wing that ruined the Typhoon's high-altitude performance was the problem. So they decided to fix it. This is where the Tempest truly begins. The core idea was deceptively simple. Take the powerful, fast, rugged airframe of the Typhoon and give it a completely new wing, far thinner than before, shaped to slip through the air with much less drag at high speed. That single change transformed the aircraft. The thin wing let the Tempest hold its speed where the Typhoon had lost it, and it pushed the fighter's top speed to the very front rank of Piston aircraft. But the new wing created a new problem. A thin wing has far less room inside it to hold fuel, and a fighter with no fuel is useless. The solution gave the Tempest its unmistakable silhouette. The designers stretched the nose, inserting an extra fuel tank ahead of the cockpit. That long, elegant snout is the easiest way to tell a Tempest from the Typhoon it grew out of, and it is the visible signature of the compromise that made the aircraft work. The result, in the main wartime version, was one of the fastest piston engine fighters in the world at low and medium altitude. Near the ground, where so much of the air war over Western Europe was actually fought, very little could outrun it. It could exceed 430 miles an hour down low, and it combined that speed with heavy cannon armament and the same toughness that had let the Typhoon absorb punishment and keep flying. It could dive faster than almost anything it met, and that dive would soon become one of its deadliest tactics. The Tempest was not a delicate dogfighter that turned in tight circles. It was a fast, heavy, hard-hitting machine that fought on its own terms, slashing in at high speed, striking, and climbing away before the enemy could respond. It entered frontline service in the spring of 1944, and almost immediately it was handed a mission that seemed tailor-made for it. In June of that year, only days after the Normandy landings, Germany unleashed a new terror weapon against London. It was a small, pilotless flying bomb, an early cruise missile that droned across the Channel and fell on the city below. The British called them doodlebugs. They came in their thousands, day and night, and they were fast and low, which made them maddeningly hard to stop. Most fighters simply could not catch them. The Tempest could, The fastest low-altitude fighter the RAF had was thrown into the defense of southern England, and the Tempest wings became the most successful flying bomb killers of the entire campaign. Pilots learned to intercept the bombs in a high-speed dive, opening fire from a careful distance, because a flying bomb that exploded too close could destroy the fighter that killed it. And here we meet one of the most famous images of the whole war, the one most people half remember, even if they have never heard the word Tempest. The story goes that pilots, running low on ammunition, would fly alongside a flying bomb, slip a wingtip under its stubby wing, and flip it out of the sky. That story is true, but it deserves an honest correction, because this is where legend and record start to part ways. The classic image of metal grinding against metal, of a fighter physically slapping a bomb out of the air, is mostly myth. In reality, the safest and most common method was not to touch the bomb at all. A pilot would ease his wingtip very close to the bomb's wing, and the rushing air spilling off his own wing would disturb the airflow over the bomb, toppling its crude gyroscopes and sending it tumbling down without any contact. It was a delicate, dangerous trick, and it really happened, but it worked through air, not impact. Guns destroyed the overwhelming majority of the flying bombs the Tempests killed. The wingtip became a legend because it is a wonderful image, but the truth is more subtle and more impressive than the myth. As the Allied armies pushed into Europe, the Tempests crossed the Channel and went on the offensive, and here they faced something genuinely new. By the final months of the war, Germany was flying the first operational jet fighter, an aircraft so fast that no piston engine could hope to match it in level flight, and yet Tempest pilots shot several of them down. The truth behind that achievement is more interesting than a simple tale of one fighter beating another. The jets were vicious in the air, but they were vulnerable at their slowest and most predictable moments, taking off and landing. Tempest pilots learned to loiter near the jet bases waiting, and to pounce when a jet was heavy with fuel, low and slow, unable to use the speed that was its only real advantage. It was not that the Tempest could outfly a jet, it was that good pilots in a fast, capable fighter found the one window where the jet's strength meant nothing. That is a lesson about tactics and timing, far more than about raw performance, and it is exactly the kind of nuance the legends usually strip away. So where does the Tempest really stand, once you separate the legend from the documented record? Here is the honest verdict. Unlike many wartime machines whose reputations are inflated, the Tempest's problem is almost the opposite. It is underrated, not overrated. By the standards of 1944 and 45, it was a superb low and medium altitude fighter, arguably the best piston fighter Britain produced, fast, powerful, and respected by the men who flew it and the men who faced it. But it was not a flawless wonder weapon, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of myth. It arrived late, only seeing real combat in the war's final year. It was built in modest numbers compared with the Spitfire and the American Mustang, which is a large part of why it slipped from public memory. Its complex engine never stopped demanding careful maintenance, and for all the cleverness of its thin wing, it remained at its very best down low, not in the thin air high above. It was a specialist that happened to be brilliant at what it did, rather than a machine that did everything. Its legacy, though, reaches further than its short combat career suggests. The lessons of that thin, fast wing did not die with the war. Hawker took the Tempest's bloodline and refined it into one of the fastest and finest piston fighters ever built, an aircraft that would fly on into the jet age and even fight in the skies over Korea, holding its own against jets years after the propeller was supposed to be obsolete. The Tempest sat at the very end of a long road, the last great chapter of the piston engine fighter before the jet swept everything aside. It was the peak, and the peak arrived just as the mountain was about to vanish. And maybe that is the truest thing about the Hawker Tempest. It was a machine of contradictions. Born from a failure, it became a triumph. Designed to fight high, it ruled the low. Famous for a wingtip trick it mostly never needed to perform, it earned a quieter, deeper greatness through speed and skill and the courage of the men in its cockpit. It was, by a fair reading of the record, the finest fighter Britain ever flew with a propeller, and almost nobody remembers its name. Perhaps the real measure of a weapon is not how loudly history shouts about it, but how good it actually was when it mattered. By that measure, the forgotten Tempest has nothing to prove. It was simply, quietly, the best.